Whether rainy days make you sad or happy, or something else entirely, the fact is that rain affects us all. There's something about the way it sounds, the way it affects the air around us. It brings out something within us, and maybe, just maybe, it brings out those creepy, crawly things that hide in the forgotten places. So, let's just sit back for a while and enjoy some allegedly true scary stories with the relaxing or perhaps ominous sound of rain. Keep in mind, you can have your story narrated too. Just share it with us at darknessprevails.org/submit or darkstories.org. Why I Hate Thunder, from Another French Surrender. When I was 12 years old, my grandparents and I went to our campground like every year. And this year was no different, except that my grandpa had to leave early, leaving it to me and my grandma for the time. We had the camper to ourselves. It started like any other day. We woke up and got ready, then went to the park. There were a few kids there my age, and when I said hi to them, they all said hi back except for one of them. It was a little girl who was just staring at the pond. She seemed antisocial, which wasn't uncommon. I've seen it before. Kids who aren't brave enough to jump in, so they just sit back and watch other people enjoy it. A few hours later, it was beginning to get dark, so we all went back to our campers. It was then that I heard a loud clap of thunder in the distance a few miles away. A storm was rolling in. Right as we made it back to the camper and I was closing the door, the rain began to come down at a rapid pace. So my grandma and I put in a movie and enjoyed the sound of rain. The night went on like usual. At one point, I look outside to see if I had left anything out there, worried that the rain could damage anything that I forgot. When I look outside, a bolt of lightning illuminates the area, but it wasn't the loud and sudden boom that caused me to jump. Rather, it was the appearance of a little girl's face, half submerged in the stream nearby the camper. The eyes were just looking at our camper, staring right at me, despite the raging water. My grandpa hid a Bowie knife at the back of one of his drawers. So, scared, I found it and got it out, waiting until morning with it, afraid that that little girl in the stream would come to the camper. I stayed up until I could see the sun through the blinds. Then I put the knife away and woke up my grandma. I went outside with her to go to the restrooms. I find muddy footprints and muddy handprints on our camper door. Nowadays, every time I hear the sound of thunder in the distance, I can't help but lock all the doors and windows around the house, closing all the blinds. But sometimes, I swear I can see a little girl outside, and she's staring at me. My friend's mother isn't human. From Baier. I was 8 or 9 years old, being raised in Denmark. So I was quite young when I came to the realization that my friend Morten's mom was not human. After school, Morten and I would usually hang out in our small town. We had a harbor, which was a really cool place to hang out at and play. There was always a huge ship docked there, and we liked to pretend that it was a pirate ship. We even got permission to play on it. Now, Morten lived about 500 meters from there, so we could always go to his house to eat whenever we got hungry. On this occasion, it was the first time I'd enter his home. We would usually just hang out at my place when the weather was bad. I had 2 different Xboxes in 2 different rooms, and plenty of games to play. It started when it began to rain one day, and we were in the middle of playing pirates on that old ship. So we ran to his home as fast as we could, trying to trip each other on the way. We eventually made it to his house and ran into the living room, where it was dry. His mom sat on the couch and said that she had made sandwiches and lemonade for us, and that it was ready for us in the kitchen. But as I entered the kitchen, I noticed that there was something really off about the place. There were strange-looking fingerprints all over, especially on the plates that held our food. I immediately asked my friend about this, pointing to the strange, slimy substance on the bottom of our plates. They were in the shape of fingers. He looked at me and just nodded like it was normal, explaining to me that it's just from his mom. Yeah, he said. She's got this disorder or something. She's got weird sweat. Weird sweat. That was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. But being a kid, I simply rolled with it. Then I began snacking on my sandwiches, trying my best not to focus on the strange, earthy, and sulfury smell that seemed to linger close to the fingerprints. We made our way back to the living room and sat down. Morton's mom still sat there in the same position. She hadn't budged an inch. We snacked, turning on the TV and distracting ourselves with whatever animated show we could find. At one point, I remember glancing back at his mom for no particular reason. She was still smiling, still staring straight ahead. Not at the TV, not at anything in particular, actually. And while I looked back at her for only the briefest moment, I witnessed something I'll never forget. Her mouth opened, and her perfectly symmetrical white teeth began to move around, like bright white insects, seeming to switch positions like they were playing musical chairs with her gums. When the teeth settled down, she closed her mouth again, never blinking, never lowering that smile. I put my sandwich down and looked back at the TV, wondering what the hell I just saw. After that, I was too afraid to go back to his house. And now, after all these years, I wonder if what I saw was real, or if it was some super vivid waking nightmare I had that just felt really real. The Old Road, from Shiverz. The old road is the road that is seldom taken. Maybe you'll find the odd dog walker in the day, but at night no one uses it. Stories are passed around about the goings-on there. Some folks have even taken their own lives on the old road. There have been animals who have mauled people there, despite the lack of predators in the area. And people have been stalked, or worse. And there's even a tale of an entity known locally as the Windwalker, which is another story entirely. The old road is a 3-mile stretch of beaten and cracked concrete, surrounded by farmers' fields and patches of woodland, without a single streetlight to pave your way. I was 24 at the time. I was at my friend's house in the neighboring town. It was getting late, and I remember it being past midnight. Normally, I would stay over. However, my friend's girlfriend was around, so I wasn't going to intrude. I bid my farewell and set off. It was dark, and I recall it being bitterly cold, even for the winter season. Not only that, but rain had started to fall. I'd have to get home quickly if I didn't want to fall ill. I set off towards the old road, which was my usual route home, even at night. Despite the stories, I found the old road to be a beautiful walk, with amazing views of the stars overhead, thanks to the lack of streetlights. The view of distant towns and villages nestled in valleys, their lights shining, it all made a beautiful backdrop. It was supposed to be a peaceful and serene walk home that would help me unwind. Even if I was to bump into someone, I always held the notion that they would be scared of me, just as I was of them, so we would just avoid each other. I came to a set of old stone steps which led down to the old road. I remember standing there peering into the darkness that enveloped the road ahead of me. Something in my gut was telling me to turn around. I was getting bad vibes this night, which was unusual. I took this road home all the time, and I'd never felt that dubious about it. I swallowed down the feeling, the rain falling harder on me. All I wanted to do was get home and out of the horrible weather. I pushed onwards. After all, the well-lit roads were built in such a way that it would add an extra mile to my journey, so I was once again reminded that this was the best way to go. The skies overhead seemed to be a solid canvas of clouds, hindering all view of the stars. Even the distant villages were barely visible through the haze of falling rain and mist. With the lack of stars and moon to light my way, the road I was walking on was now barely visible. My hearing was impaired too, due to the rain falling. I was approaching the halfway point of my journey. By this time I was shaking. I was soaked wet through and through, and the winter's temperature was quite cold. My skin sort of stung. As I was worrying about how cold I was, my thoughts were interrupted by an ear-splitting cry. It was coming from directly in front of me, maybe 30 feet or so. It was a cry of pain, and living in a rural area, I deduced that it was a cry of a sheep almost immediately. The cry was prolonged. It started off loud, yet slowly reduced into nothingness. Once again, I could only hear the sound of raindrops peppering the concrete around me. I stood still, waiting for another sound, yet none came. I then stared in the direction that I heard the cry, and I couldn't see the poor animal. A dry stone wall impeded my view. That intense gut feeling to go back on the main road returned. I was feeling scared. I wasn't one to normally give in to fear. I always thought that there were logical explanations to everything out there. That's probably why my mind decided that this sheep was probably in labor, not knowing when lambing season was. This was the best thought my mind could procure to calm me down. With my mind latching on to this thought, I felt the uneasiness fade, and my thoughts returned to my soaked clothing and the bitter cold. I carried on, again my goal just to get home. But as I was passing the area where I had heard the sheep's cries, my ears perked up. There was a sound, almost a squelchy sound, like ripping. Almost like someone was eating a rack of ribs drenched in marinade. I got low to the ground and slowly approached the wall, thinking that a newly born lamb was being mauled by a fox. It wasn't common by any means, but it's not unheard of. Foxes, while beautiful and often cute, will eat pretty much anything. I reached the wall. My hand was in my pocket clutching my keys, which had a small torch attached to them. The torch wasn't powerful. Its primary function was to shine a small light on my door so I could find the keyhole. It was pretty useless, but it's all I had. I had my finger poised on the torch's button. My idea was to surprise this creature, hopefully scaring it away. As I rose up and turned on the torch, I did not see a lamb. I didn't see a fox. All I saw was a sheep lying motionless on its side. There was a gaping hole in its chest, releasing steam as the warm blood cooled down in the harsh weather. Surprisingly, my eyes weren't locked onto the sheep. They were instead staring at two elongated hands which were placed on either side of this wound. These hands were dark, almost black. They were bony and armed with long, sharp nails. I was possibly only looking at these hands for a second before my eyes decided to look upwards. to see the face to which these hands belonged to. It was as dark as its hands. My awful torch didn't give me much visibility, but I could make out the face, which was long and slim. Its skin looked flawlessly smooth, without a single hair and no distinctive features. At first, I could only make out a mouth, which had a chunk of meat draping down from it. And then I found them. 2 eyes that weren't glowing. They weren't vibrant at all. They were just very dark, almost as dark as the skin around them. As I stared on in shock, it took me a second or two to realize those dark, empty eyes were looking back at me, and with that, they released me of all my courage. The creature was about 10 feet away, eyes locked onto me, expression blank, just silently staring, perhaps challenging me to move. Fear overtook me. My body began to shake violently. I am not ashamed to admit that tears rolled down my face, and I let out a whimper. This creature, whatever it was, it reacted to my whimper, dropping the chunk of flesh from its mouth. It rose on its hind legs, standing to about 7 feet tall. It was very slender, with arms dangling down to its knees. I stood there in shock, in fear, feeling like I could keel over at any moment. Then the creature, this being, took 1 step towards me. That's when something snapped inside of me. Fight or flight took hold, and I grasped at a piece of rock from the dry stone walling I was stood in front of. I flung it at the creature, then I ran, not even checking to see if my projectile hit its mark. I was being pushed by adrenaline. I was sprinting as fast as my legs could carry me. The thoughts of being frozen and soaked were now a distant memory. I wanted to call for help, but as I pulled my phone from my pocket, I dropped it in my panic, and I could not slow down to retrieve it. I was just too terrified. I didn't even want to look back. For all I knew, that thing was right behind me. All I could do, all I had left, was my legs and the adrenaline that fueled them. I made it to the end of the old road. My house was on the street to which it junctioned. It was only 4 buildings up from there, and as I reached the door, I found the keyhole with ease, retreating inside. I then locked all the doors and windows, grabbing a knife and sitting on the couch. The adrenaline had left me then. My body and mind were both exhausted from the ordeal, and I refused to sleep. Considering we did not live far from the old road, I knew that thing could be outside the house, and every gust of wind or rustle of leaves, to me, it was that thing skulking in the bushes. Every time my cat moved around the house made me think that the creature was inside my home. It was a long night, full of jump scares from the tiniest pinprick, and my only companion was fear. Eventually, daylight came, giving me the courage to get some sleep. I don't know how long I was sleeping, but 3 thuds could be heard from my front door. Before I came to, I was on my feet, knife in hand, poised and ready to defend myself. I walked over to my window, peering out. I noticed 2 police officers were at my door. I put down my knife and let the officers inside. They asked a series of questions, wondering where I was last night, what I was doing. I willingly answered, saying I was at my friend's house and came home via the old road. They asked if I noticed anything suspicious. I lied and said I hadn't. After all, who would believe me? I'd be the laughingstock of the town, or even be admitted to a mental hospital. The officer that was doing the talking just stared at me. Obviously, he didn't believe me. He then handed me my phone, saying he found it on the old road, not too far from a scene of a disturbance that they'd been called to. My phone screen was cracked, but luckily it was still working. I asked what disturbances they meant. Reluctantly, he proceeded to tell me that a field of sheep had been slaughtered. They found my phone, which is what led them to my house, hoping that I would have information. It didn't take long for people to blame escaped zoo animals, or perhaps foxes were on the rise. Some people even said that the farmer just wanted insurance from the livestock. I, however, knew different. I never told anyone about what happened to me, not even my close friends. They always thought I was an oddball anyway, so I didn't want to add fuel to the fire and become the butt end of jokes. 4 years passed, and a friend of mine came to visit from London in his car. After a social detour, he found himself on the old road with night upon him. He saw a small creature huddled over a fox in the middle of the road, consuming the poor thing. His car startled the small thing. It then glared directly at him. Even with his headlights shining on it, he couldn't make much out, only that it was black with lanky limbs, and it was surprisingly thin. Hearing his story, I was compelled to share my own with him. We deduced that these creatures were of the same species, which worries me that there isn't only one of them out there. At any rate, I haven't been back to the old road alone, not even during the day. People have their reasons for not using that road, and now I have my very own. Power outage. From Noah. I live in a small town in Texas. Football is a big deal here, so when I was sick one night, my parents went to watch my cousin play in a different town about half an hour away. Anyway, I was home alone at the time. I was just listening to the sound of rain drumming against my window, while having some music playing too. All of a sudden, the lights in the whole house just shut off. Now I knew this wasn't due to the storm because there wasn't any lightning outside. I suspected that it was my friends pranking me. They lived next door and had done this before to creep me out when I was home alone. Getting mad, I grabbed my phone off of my dresser. I called my friend up, telling him to quit messing around and to turn the power back on. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, anger showing in my voice. "Just turn the power back on and go home," I said, hanging up the phone. He tried calling back a few times, but I muted my phone, laid down, and waited for the power to come back on. After waiting about a minute, I was about to go outside myself and do it. I knew where the breakers were. The moment I got up, though, I heard a knock at the door. I walked over, getting ready to fling the door open and yell at my friend. But something stopped me and told me to look through the peephole first. So I did, and instead of seeing my friend Gil, I saw a strange older man. He was huge too. He stood at about 6.5 feet tall and was built more like a linebacker. I panicked the moment I saw him, and then he tried to turn the doorknob. Luckily, the door was locked, as my parents always left it that way. And then he said to me, "I know you're in there." I quietly walked to my room, grabbing a bat and making sure that the man couldn't hear me moving from outside. I knew if it came down to fighting him off, I would be done for. I was 5'7" and 135 max, so I locked my door and pushed my dresser in front of it. I stood there, listening for the man's next move. I could hear him jiggling the doorknob like crazy, until finally, I heard a door open. The man had gotten inside our house. I stayed quiet, panicking inside my own head, listening to the man walking around and saying, "Where are you?" He began to come towards my room and slammed against it once. I was ready to use my bat if he ever got in, but right before he hit it the second time, I heard sirens coming down the street. He ran out of the house, and disappeared. Those cops weren't even coming here, and were just passing through with their sirens on by coincidence, driving towards someone else in need. But I'm forever grateful that that random act was what saved my life. Shadow Couple, from Anonymous. I'm a 34-year-old magician and children's entertainer in Kent, in the UK. This is a truly creepy and freaky encounter I had when I was younger. I must have been around 8 or 9 years old. I had a really creepy incident that I thought of only as a nightmare, but it was confirmed as actually happening only last year. Let me begin. I hated thunderstorms back then. I would sleep with my parents if there was a bad one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to sleep. One night, there was a loud thunderstorm going on. It was scary, so much so that even my sister, who can sleep through anything, was awakened in the middle of the night and joined us in my parents' bed. It must have been the early hours of the morning, and we were all asleep, but I was awakened by a weird crying sound. I thought it was either my parents or my sister having a nightmare, so I tried to go back to sleep. My dad had a torch turned on as a nightlight, so neither me nor my sister would get scared. When I looked towards the wall for a brief moment, the only thing that was silhouetted on the wall was a stool near my parents' bed. The storm had died down and the weird crying had stopped, so I was quickly dozing off again. But then I heard the bedroom door creaking open. When I opened my eyes to see what it was, there was a shadow. A shadow of a man with a freakishly long nose. I'll state now that this was not a shadow being, but just a shadow being cast in the wall. The only light in the room was from the torch, so it must have been between that and the wall, but there was nobody there. I remember the man walking to the shadow of the stool in the wall, bending down and putting his shadow head on the shadow stool. Then just as suddenly, a shadow of a woman came into view. She was large in frame and seemed to be carrying something in her hand. She walked up to the man and lifted the object, then brought it down hard onto his shadowed head. There was a loud thud from the direction of the stool, followed by a brief scream. You may be wondering why I said something was in the woman's hand. Well, what I remember it looking like was an axe. I never told anyone about this, as I thought it was a nightmare. But just last year, my family was telling ghost stories around a barbecue, and my dad mentioned a man with a long nose that he used to see in the street. I interrupted to tell my story, and then my sister interrupted me to tell something too. She asked me if I had seen the same thing, giving exact details to my story that I just told you guys. We had the same experience, with the only difference being she remembers the lady holding a big knife instead of an axe. Bear in mind, I never mentioned this story to anyone. She also claims to remember that the stool fell over when the knife or axe hit the other shadow's neck. This was terrifying to realize it was real. That was the scariest part, because I wish it was still just a nightmare in my head. Whoever wrote that old song, Rain, Rain, Go Away, they can suck it, because I love the rain, and sometimes it's the only thing that can bring me joy. Add some scary stories on top of that, and you've got a very happy darkness. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own you want to share, go to darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. If you want to support the show, check the links in the description. You can use my Acorns link to start investing in your future, and it helps me out a little bit too. Or donate on Patreon. Or shop our merchandise and get some creepy cool shirts. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous video. Titled, My Grandma Knew What Happens After We Die, and She Was Horrified. 5 true horror stories. Banana Mukbang says, Grandma been sleeping a little too long. Yeah, and Grandma better go back to bed, or Grandma ain't gonna get no breakfast. Summer Mohegan says, best channel ever. Oh, you're a fan of JonTron too, I see. King J says, King J on here. Darkness Prevails is the best. Guys, stop trying to flatter me so much. You're the best. You're breathtaking. I'm Dead Inside says, don't shout me out again. This comment is to prove I'm early. Oh. Whoops. And Brock Bernard says, I stopped everything I was doing to watch this. Well, as long as your wife wasn't in labor, I'm very happy you love my channel so much. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They are awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.